The ring wasn't hers to choose. The house wasn't hers to arrange. Even the name she carried into the church on that gray November morning belonged to a man she had spoken to fewer than 6 times. Nora Voss had spent 24 years learning to be useful without being wanted, and she understood, as the carriage pulled up the wet stone drive of the Ashford estate, that today would be no different. The marriage had been her father's idea, which was generous language for what it actually was. Her father's debt restructured. Lawrence Ashford was 41 years old, a widower with a tobacco and textile interest in Richmond, and a son at university and a house that needed a woman in it. Her father had 2 daughters, and one of them, the one everyone looked at, was already spoken for. Nora was not the one everyone looked at. She knew this the same way she knew the household accounts and the price of winter coal and which supplier her father had been overpaying for 3 years. She knew it practically, without self-pity, the way you know the distance between 2 towns. It was simply the measurement of things. She had said yes because she was 24, and the alternative was watching her father's debts eat through the house she'd managed since her mother died, and because Lawrence Ashford had looked at her across the dinner table on their second meeting and said, without performance, that he valued honesty above most things and found it rare. She had said, "So do I," and he had nodded once, like a man checking an entry in a ledger, and that had been, in its way, more than she'd expected. They were not in love. She had not expected love. What she had expected was something she could work with, a life with clear terms and enough room to breathe, and for the first 8 months at Ashford House, that was more or less what she had. She learned the house the way she learned everything, systematically and without drama. The kitchen accounts had been run by Mrs. Pratt for 11 years and contained 3 inefficiencies that Nora identified in the first 2 weeks and corrected in the third. The household staff adjusted to her with the careful neutrality of people who had learned not to form attachments to women who arrived in this house. Lawrence's first wife had died in childbirth. His second engagement had ended badly, the details of which Nora was given in edited form by the housekeeper, and in full form by her own powers of inference. Lawrence himself was not difficult. He was absent, often, which was a different thing. He had business in Richmond and in Charlotte, and a pattern of correspondence that filled 2 writing desks, and kept him out of the house more days than not. When he was home, they ate dinner and talked about practical things: the roof on the east wing, the price of tobacco, a letter from his son at university that had been 3 weeks coming. She was not unhappy. She was not happy. She was occupied, which in her experience was the closest thing to contentment available to women in her position. What changed things was Lydia. Lydia was Lawrence's younger sister. She arrived in March with 2 trunks, and a manner that suggested she found most rooms too small for her, and most people too slow. And she moved into the west wing of Ashford House with the confidence of someone returning to a home rather than visiting one. She was 30, beautiful in the way that required no particular effort, and she had been living, Nora gathered, with a cousin in Charlottesville who had finally run out of patience. Nora tried. She believed in trying. She had extended every reasonable hospitality in the first week, shown Lydia the library, introduced her to the household routine, made space at the dinner table and in the morning schedule. Lydia had received all of it with a pleasant, faintly dismissive warmth, the warmth of a woman who considered herself the original occupant of a space, now temporarily rearranged for a guest. The trouble began in April, at the Harmon Spring Assembly. Nora had been attending the local assemblies for 8 months by then. She had formed no close friendships, which was not unusual for her, but she had formed the beginnings of regard with 2 women, Mrs. Calloway and her sister Miss Ida Morse, both of whom she found direct and unperforming, and worth the effort of knowing. They had been kind to her in the specific way of women who recognized a person trying to find their footing in unfamiliar ground. It was at the April assembly that Nora first noticed what Lydia was doing. She noticed it not because she was watching for it, but because she overheard it, which was something that happened to women who were not often looked at. People spoke freely around them. Lydia was standing near the refreshment table with 2 women Nora didn't know well, and she was saying, in the pleasant, regretful tone of a woman confiding something she wished she didn't have to, that Lawrence had not been himself lately. That Nora managed the house with great efficiency, certainly, but that Lawrence found the atmosphere somewhat cold. That her brother was a man of particular temperament, sensitive to warmth, and that he had confided in Lydia that he sometimes felt more like a lodger in his own home than a husband. The 3 women listening made sympathetic sounds. Lydia added that she said this only because she cared about her brother's happiness, which everyone understood, and that Nora was a perfectly capable woman, simply perhaps not entirely suited to Lawrence's particular needs. Then the conversation moved elsewhere, and Lydia helped herself to punch. Nora stood 6 feet away and felt the words settle into her the way cold settled into a house when a window was left open. Not sharp, just pervasive. She did not say anything that evening. She went home in the carriage with Lawrence, who had spent the assembly talking politics with 3 other men, and had no particular awareness of anything that had happened. And she sat in the dark and took inventory of what she knew. Lawrence had not said those things to Lydia. She was almost certain of it. Lawrence was not a man given to confidences, and the things he was alleged to have confided did not match any version of him she had observed in 8 months. But almost certain was not entirely certain, and that gap was the thing that kept her sitting up after Lawrence had gone to bed. She could be wrong. She could be reading a situation she was too close to see clearly. She had spent 8 months in a marriage that lacked warmth, and warmth was not her natural register either, and it was possible that Lawrence was lonelier in this marriage than he had expressed. She turned it over in her mind for 3 days, precise as an account she couldn't make balance. On the 4th day, she asked Lawrence directly. She chose the morning, when they were both in the breakfast room and the household noise hadn't yet started, and she said, not looking at her plate, that she had heard something at the assembly that she wanted to ask him about, rather than assume. She told him what she'd overheard, word for word, without editorial. She asked whether it was accurate. Lawrence put down his fork. He looked at her with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and didn't know yet how to categorize. No, he said. I said none of that to Lydia or to anyone. Where exactly did you hear this? 6 feet from Lydia, Nora said. She was telling it to Mrs. Barnett and 2 others. Lawrence was quiet for a moment. His face went through something she'd learned to read in 8 months. Not anger, at least not immediately. Something more like calculation, a man checking a number he'd been given against a number he knew. Lydia has been protective of me since Eleanor died, he said finally. She sometimes oversteps in that protection. That is not protection, Nora said. What I described is not protection. It is a woman telling a room that your wife is cold and unsuitable and that you are unhappy. Lawrence looked at the table. She knew from his stillness that he was not disagreeing. He was deciding whether to say so out loud. She did not push. She had learned that pressing her husband before he was ready produced only the sound of a man defending his sister, rather than the sound of a man being honest. I'll speak to her, he said finally. She didn't ask what he would say. What Lydia said, when Lawrence spoke to her, Nora didn't hear directly. She heard the murmur of it from the hallway, voices controlled, civil, the specific quality of a conversation that was being conducted at low volume on purpose. Afterward, Lydia came to find Nora in the parlor, with an expression of warm contrition that was so perfectly constructed, it could have been framed and hung on a wall. I want to apologize, Lydia said, for anything I said that may have reached you in an unfortunate form. I sometimes speak too freely about matters that concern my brother, and I can see how what I said might have been interpreted badly. Nora looked at her over the household ledger. Might have been interpreted, she repeated. Lydia's smile remained steady. I do care about Lawrence's happiness. You must understand that. I understand it, Nora said. I also understand the difference between caring about someone's happiness and telling a room full of people that their wife is insufficient. She set down the ledger. I accept your apology. Lydia left. The apology resolved nothing. They both knew it resolved nothing. The story was already in the room at the assembly, already the shape of things, already moving through Charlottesville and the county the way stories moved, finding every table that would receive it. Nora went back to the ledger and let herself feel the full weight of it the way she felt everything that mattered, precisely and without looking away. The Harmon Summer Assembly was 6 weeks later. Nora was not, by nature, a woman who made scenes. She had spent 24 years being the woman who didn't. She had managed silence and efficiency and competence in rooms where none of those things were particularly valued, and she had carried those qualities the way she carried everything else, without complaint. But she had also spent 6 weeks watching the story spread, watching Mrs. Barnett's expression shift when Nora entered a room, watching 2 of Lawrence's business associates develop a sudden interest in Lydia's version of the household, watching a woman she had been building a friendship with, Mrs. Calloway, become cautious in her warmth. 6 weeks of being the cold, unsuitable wife in a story she hadn't written and hadn't been asked to dispute. She dressed for the summer assembly herself, no borrowed dress, her own, the blue one she'd bought in Richmond 3 months ago that she hadn't found occasion to wear. Lawrence attended with her. He had said nothing further about Lydia since the breakfast room conversation, and Nora had not raised it. She was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had a particular quality she had learned to recognize. It felt like standing at the edge of something and knowing the edge would hold. At the assembly, Lydia was already present, already arranged at the center of the room with the specific ease of a woman who had never doubted she was the most important person in it. Nora found Mrs. Calloway first. She crossed the room without hurrying, without the performance of urgency, and she stopped beside Mrs. Calloway near the east window and said quietly, but without dropping her voice below the audible register, that she wanted to address something she understood had been circulating. Mrs. Calloway looked at her with the careful attention of a woman who had not yet decided which version of a story she believed. Nora said, "My husband did not tell his sister that he finds our home cold, or that he considers himself a lodger in it, or that he is unhappy in his marriage. I have asked him directly. He confirmed that he said none of it. I do not know why Lydia said what she said, but I know what she said is not accurate." A pause. Around them the assembly moved. But the nearest 5 people had gone quiet in the specific way of people suddenly paying very close attention to something else. Mrs. Calloway said, carefully, "That is a serious thing to state in a room like this." "I know that," Nora said. "I am stating it because I have been the subject of a story in this room for 6 weeks, and I would rather be seen disagreeing with it than pretending it isn't happening." She did not look toward Lydia. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the room, the same way you felt weather change before the sky changed. It was Miss Ida Morse who came to stand beside her first, not because Ida was impulsive, she wasn't, but because Ida had observed things over the preceding 6 weeks that she'd been quietly assembling into a picture she hadn't known what to do with until now. She simply moved to Nora's left and stood there, which was not a gesture that required explanation. Lawrence appeared at Nora's side 20 minutes after the conversation at the east window. He didn't ask what had happened. He had heard it in pieces from 3 separate directions in the preceding quarter hour. He stood beside his wife and said nothing, and his standing there beside her and saying nothing was itself a statement. The room was capable of reading. Nora accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing tray, and held it without drinking, and felt the weight of what she'd done. The way she felt everything, taking full measure. That night in the carriage home, Lawrence did not speak for the first 10 minutes. She let him have the silence. Then he said, without preamble, "What you did tonight." "I know," she said. He was quiet again. "Then you could have come to me." "I did come to you," she said, "in the breakfast room 6 weeks ago, and you said you would speak to her." A pause. "I did speak to her." Nora looked out the window at the dark Virginia road. "Speaking to her did not stop the story from moving," she said. "It is still moving. It was still in that room tonight. I stopped waiting for it to stop on its own." Lawrence said nothing for a moment, then, quietly, "I know." It was the most useful thing he'd said about the situation since the breakfast room, and it sat between them for the rest of the ride home. The next morning brought its own developments, the specific variety that followed from saying something true in a social setting where true things had a cost. Mrs. Barnett sent a note canceling a standing invitation. 2 women who had been growing toward Nora in the preceding months took a step back, not dramatically, but perceptibly, in the way that people stepped back when they weren't sure yet which side of a story would turn out to be safer to stand on. Miss Ida Morse, by contrast, appeared at the Ashford house back door at 9 in the morning with a jar of preserves, and the expression of a woman who had made up her mind. Nora let her in and poured coffee, and Ida said, sitting at the kitchen table, with the directness that Nora had always appreciated in her, "I want you to know that I was at the Harmon Assembly in April. I heard what Lydia said. I should have said something then, and I didn't because it wasn't my household's business. I was wrong about that." "You weren't obligated," Nora said. "No," Ida said. "But I was capable, which is a different thing." She set down her cup. "Do you have anything beyond your husband's word? If Lydia denies it, if she says she was misunderstood, if the story shifts to your motives rather than her statement, what do you have?" Nora looked at her. It was, she thought, the right question. The question of a practical woman. "I have what I observed directly," she said, "and my husband's account. And I suspect there are other women in this county who have heard Lydia speak this way before. Not about me, about others." Ida's expression confirmed it without her needing to say it outright. She knew something. Nora had suspected it. Nora said. Ida told her. The story was not about the Ashford household. It was an older one, from 3 years prior, involving a woman named Mrs. Celia Grant, who had been Lydia's friend and then, when circumstances shifted, had become the subject of a quiet, precise, socially distributed accounting that no one had traced back to Lydia at the time because no one had thought to look. Mrs. Grant, Ida said, left Charlottesville, moved to her sister's in Richmond. She didn't come back. Nora sat with this for a long moment, then she said, "Can you write down what you know, specific dates, if you have them, what was said to whom, when? That will make it real," Ida said. "It is already real," Nora said. "I would like it to also be usable." The conversation with Lawrence happened that evening. Nora had spent the afternoon compiling what she had. Ida's account in writing, the specific statements she had personally overheard, the timeline of the stories spread through the county, the names of women who had received it. She laid it on the table in the study the way she laid things on tables, organized, dated, without preamble. Lawrence sat across from her and read it. She watched his face while he read. She had learned his face over 8 months, the subtle registers of it, the way it arranged itself differently when he was thinking honestly, versus when he was thinking protectively. He was not a bad man. This was the thing she had understood early and returned to now. He was not bad, only loyal in the particular way that made people slow to see what their loyalty was covering for. He set the pages down. He looked at her. "I didn't know about Celia Grant," he said. "I believed you wouldn't," Nora said. A long silence. He picked up the pages again, set them back. His jaw moved once. She did not push. She let him arrive at it. "What would you like to do?" he said finally. "I would like to address this properly," she said. "Lydia has done this before, to Celia Grant. To others I suspect I haven't yet found. She will do it again, to me or to the next woman you bring into this house. The story she told about our marriage will continue to live in this county until something more accurate replaces it." She paused. "I would like to replace it." Lawrence looked at her. "By what means?" "By speaking to those she spoke to," Nora said. "By giving them the same account I gave in public last night, with documentation this time. By asking Lydia directly, in your presence, to account for what she said about Celia Grant." He was quiet for a moment. "Lydia will deny it." "She may," Nora said. "But denial requires a story, and a story leaves a shape. And I am very good at finding shapes." Something moved across his face. She'd seen it once before, on the morning in the breakfast room. A kind of reluctant, recalibrating recognition. The look of a man who had assumed a thing about his wife and was now revising the assumption with full information. "You are," he said, somewhat quietly, "a more formidable person than I understood when we married." "You understood the household accounts," Nora said. "You didn't ask about the rest." His mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "I'm asking now." She gave him time to sit with it. She did not require him to arrive immediately, only eventually, and Lawrence Ashford, she had learned, was a man who arrived. Slowly, without announcement, but without retreat. The conversation with Lydia happened the next morning. Lawrence arranged it, which mattered. It was his study, his house, his sister, his marriage. And he sat at the desk with the particular quiet authority of a man who had decided something and was not going to be talked back out of it. And Lydia came in with the expression of a woman confident in her footing and reading the room correctly, and losing that confidence by degrees as she understood what the room actually contained. Nora stood. She did not sit. She had decided to stand because standing meant she was not a petitioner, and she had nothing to petition for. She had the truth, which required no posture except its own. She said, without anger, the things she had written down. What she heard at the April assembly. What she had since learned about Celia Grant. The specific language Lydia had used in both instances. The sympathetic tone, the regretful confidence, the care taken to position the account as concern rather than characterization. Lydia's composure did not shatter. Nora had not expected it to. Lydia was too practiced for shattering. But it developed cracks, small ones at the edges, the kind that told a person more than a full break would have. What Lydia said, in the end, was, "I was protecting Lawrence." From what? Lawrence said from behind his desk. From his own choices, Lydia said, and then seemed to understand how that sounded. Nora said, "You were protecting yourself. If Lawrence's marriage succeeded, if this house became mine in the way that it should have been mine from the beginning, your position here changed. You have been here since Eleanor died. This has been your household in every way that mattered. And I came in and began to actually manage it, and that was not what you expected." A silence that had weight. "I did not intend," Lydia said, and then stopped. "You did intend," Nora said. "That's the part we're not going to agree to pretend otherwise about." Lawrence said very quietly, "Lydia, I need you to understand that what you said about Celia Grant was wrong, and what you said about Nora is wrong. And I should have been clearer about that the first time it came to me. That is also on me." He paused. "But I need you to stop." Lydia looked at her brother. Something underneath her careful surface was moving, something old and complicated, the particular grief of a woman who had organized her life around a role that was no longer available to her. Nora saw it and did not look away from it. She said, more quietly than she'd said anything else that morning, "I am not your enemy, Lydia. I am not trying to remove you from this house or from your brother's life. But I will not be the subject of your management. If you can live here on those terms, then we will find a way to do that. If you can't, then we will need to find another arrangement. Either way, we are done pretending this isn't what it is." Lydia sat very still. Then she said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to herself, I didn't know she would push back. She wasn't speaking to Nora. She was speaking to the version of events she'd been running, the version in which Nora was too quiet and too manageable, and too uncertain of her own ground to do what she had done. She was correcting the model. Lawrence looked at his wife from across the room, with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not in 8 months of practical marriage and shared breakfast table, and 2 desks worth of correspondence. He looked at her like someone seeing a thing they'd been looking at for months, and had somehow not yet actually seen. The social repair took the better part of a month. Nora did not conduct it dramatically. That was not her way. She made calls, direct ones, to the women who had received Lydia's account in April and the months after. She said the same things in each case, plainly, without seeking sympathy. That what they had heard was not accurate. That she had documentation if they had questions. And that she hoped what she was offering them now was useful in adjusting whatever impression had been formed. Some of them received it with relief, which told her they had been uncomfortable with the earlier version, and hadn't known what to do with their discomfort. Some received it with the careful neutrality of people who preferred not to be placed in positions of judgment. 2 received it with the directness of women who said frankly that they had suspected something was wrong with what they'd been told and were glad to have something to replace it with. Mrs. Calloway came to call on her own without an occasion, and sat in the Ashford parlor and said, I should have asked questions in April. I've known Lydia for 5 years and I should have known to ask questions. You believed a story that was easy to believe, Nora said. I was new to this county, I was not known to you. And Lydia presented it with care. She presented it as concern, Mrs. Calloway said. That's the thing. She made it sound like she was worried about him. That is, Nora said, what makes it effective? Mrs. Calloway looked at her with a frank assessment that Nora found, after months of careful social navigation, enormously refreshing. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect, honestly? A woman who would manage things quietly and hope it went away. I manage things, Nora said. Quietly is not always available. Lydia left Ashford House in May, not dramatically, not under compulsion, but with the specific decisiveness of a woman who had performed an accounting of her own and arrived at a figure that required a change in position. She went to her cousin in Charlottesville, the same one who had run out of patience before, which suggested to Nora that the previous departure and return had been Lydia's pattern for some time, moving between houses as social conditions required. Lawrence told her Lydia was leaving on a Tuesday morning at breakfast. He said it in the same quiet way he said most things, without announcement, as if it were a piece of household information. Nora poured tea and acknowledged it, and did not ask what had been said between them, because she had decided some conversations were his to have without her inventory. He said unprompted, She told me she had meant to help. Nora looked at her cup. I believe that, she said. I believe she understood it as help. That doesn't change what it was. Lawrence nodded once. They drank their tea. Outside, the Virginia morning pressed on the windows with the specific indifference of weather that doesn't concern itself with what happens inside. After a while he said, I owe you an accounting. She looked up at him. When we married, he said, I told you I valued honesty. He looked at his cup. I valued it in principle. I was less diligent about it in practice. He paused. I knew Lydia had particular opinions about Eleanor's successor in this house. I chose to believe she would manage them privately, and I did not check whether she was managing them privately or deploying them in assembly rooms. Nora held his gaze. That was, he said, a way of avoiding a conflict I didn't want to have. It was not honesty. He paused again. I'm telling you this now rather than letting you infer it because you have spent 8 months inferring things I should have said plainly, and that is also a correction I owe you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I appreciate that. He looked at her steadily. It is not enough. No, she said. It's a start. The summer moved. The county's social machinery found other material, as it always did. The story about the Ashford marriage did not disappear entirely. Stories never did entirely, but it found competition in newer stories. and the version that involved a cold and unsuitable wife gradually became less interesting than the version that involved a woman who had stood at the east window of the Harmon Assembly and said a true thing when it cost her something real. Miss Ida Morse's account of Celia Grant was not published anywhere. It was shared quietly between women who were positioned to receive it and know what to do with it. One of them was Mrs. Grant's own sister, who wrote to Nora in June with a letter that said, simply, "She is glad someone said it. I wanted you to know that." Nora kept the letter. She kept it in the desk where she kept the household accounts, the real ones, between the entries for April and May. Lawrence came home from Charlotte in June and stayed. She had not asked him to. He had looked, she thought, at the shape of what he'd left behind and what he'd come back to, and made a quiet private arithmetic of it. His office in Richmond could be managed with correspondence and occasional travel. The extended absences were a habit of the first marriage, not a necessity. He was in the house more. He was at the breakfast table more. He was, in the evenings, in the study where she worked on the accounts, sitting at his own desk with his own correspondence, saying nothing that required answering, simply present. It was not romantic. She would not have described it as romantic, and she suspected he wouldn't either. It was something quieter and more durable than that. The particular warmth of two people who had said true things to each other at cost, and had not retreated from what those things revealed. One evening in July he came to stand beside her at the window, where she was watching the evening light move across the south field, and he said, without the careful management of their earlier conversations, something that sounded like what it was. "You are not cold," he said. "I want to say that plainly. You are precise, and you are direct, and you do not perform warmth you don't feel. Those are not the same thing as cold." I was slow to understand the difference. She looked at the field. She felt the words land the way true words landed, not dramatically, but with weight. The weight of a thing you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing it until someone lifted a corner of it. "I have been told before," she said, "that I am not warm enough." "By whom?" he asked. "Everyone," she said. "My mother, my father, the assembly rooms I grew up in. My sister, who received all the warmth in our family's original allotment and had none left to give back." She paused. "I stopped trying to be something other than what I am. It seemed more honest." "It is more honest," he said. "It is also," she said, "sometimes very quiet." He stood beside her in the July evening quiet that she had described and let the quiet be what it was and did not try to fill it. Which was, she thought, one of the things she had come to value about him most. Later, she would think of that evening as the moment things became something other than an arrangement, not because of what was said, because of what didn't need to be. She still wrote the household accounts. She still ran them with precision, caught the inefficiencies, kept the ledger clean. This did not change. She did not expect it to change. She had spent too much of her life being the woman who kept the accounts to imagine herself as anything else, and she had stopped wanting to imagine herself as anything else. The work was real. It mattered. It was entirely hers. What changed was smaller and more significant than the accounts. It was the table they ate at and the quality of the silence across it. It was the study in the evenings with two desks in use. It was Lawrence learning to say things plainly rather than let her infer them. Not all at once, not without difficulty, but consistently, over the course of a summer that pressed its heat against every window and did not hurry for anyone. It was Miss Ida Morse becoming, gradually and without ceremony, the first real friendship Nora had maintained since her mother died. It was Lydia, sending a letter in August that was 3 paragraphs long and contained a sentence Nora read 4 times. "I did not intend you harm. I understand now that this is not the same as not causing it." She wrote back, 1 paragraph. She said, "I know, and I know those are also not the same thing." She paused, then added, "Lawrence is well. He is more present than he was. I thought you should know." She sealed it and sent it without reading it a 5th time. In September, a letter arrived from Celia Grant herself. She had heard, through the network of women who passed true things between themselves when the formal channels weren't safe, what Nora had done in her county. She wrote with the economy of someone who had learned to say difficult things briefly. "I didn't push back," she wrote. "I thought it would go away, or that no one would believe me, or that the cost was more than the result was worth. You had the same reasons and you pushed back anyway. I wanted to tell you that it mattered. Not only to me. I think you may not fully know how far the true version has traveled." Nora set the letter beside the one from Celia's sister in the desk drawer. 2 letters between the April and May accounts. She would add more, she suspected, over the coming years. Women who had found the true version useful. Women who had learned that the true version existed because someone had said it aloud in a room where it cost something. She had not said it for them. She'd set it for herself, and for the marriage she'd agreed to, and because she was not willing to be a story she hadn't written. But the fact that she'd set it for the right reasons, and it had traveled further than she knew, those two things could both be true at once. She had long since made peace with the complexity of that. The last Tuesday of October Lawrence came to find her in the garden, in the late afternoon, the way he'd developed a habit of finding her in the late afternoon, when the day's work was done, and the evening hadn't yet started. He stood beside her and looked at the south field, which had been harvested 3 weeks before, and stood in the particular stripped honest clarity of late autumn. He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "When we married," he said, "I described it as a practical arrangement, terms, utility." He paused. "I would like to renegotiate." She looked at him. "Not the terms," he said. "The description." She was quiet for a moment. The evening was coming in early, the way it came in October, pressing the light down toward the horizon and leaving everything in the particular golden clarity that didn't last. "What description would you prefer?" she said. He looked at her. He was not, by nature, a demonstrative man. He had the same quality she had, the quality of meaning what he said and saying it sparingly for that reason. When he spoke next, it was with the careful precision of a man who had taken time with the words because the words mattered. "I would like to call it a marriage," he said. "The real kind, not the arrangement kind." She held his gaze. The garden was very still. "It already is the real kind," she said. "It has been for some time." "I know," he said. "I wanted to say so." She looked back at the field, then at him, at this quiet, imperfect, increasingly honest man, who had sat beside her at 1,000 breakfast tables and been changed, as she had been changed, by the specific difficulty of saying true things out loud. "All right," she said. "Then that's what we'll call it." The evening came down around them. The field held its stripped October clarity. And Nora Ashford, who had arrived in this county in a dress she'd chosen herself and built something real from terms she hadn't been given but had learned to set, stood in her own garden beside her own husband in the life she had made from the only material she had ever trusted. The truth. Hers. Enough.